All right, welcome to the Love, Learn, Play podcast presented by the nonprofit organization Universal Enlightenment and Flourishing. Here we sit down with individuals who've dedicated their lives to helping others flourish to discuss the Love, Learn, Play mindset, which is UEF's simple framework for happiness and flourishing in life. And you can find all our episodes at uef.org and follow us on social media at UEFinsights. My name is Alan. I'll be representing UEF, and today I'm chatting with Francis Xavier Clooney, a Jesuit priest and the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. He is an expert in Hindu and Christian studies, and I can say from personal experience as an HDS alum myself, wonderful teacher who helps students learn how to think interreligiously across traditions. So, Professor Clooney, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alan. Good to be here. You have a wonderful series and a wonderful project, so I'm happy to be part of it this afternoon.
Awesome. So, Professor Clooney, you're a longtime friend of UEF, and you were a major contributor to our efforts on Bridges Across Humanity, which is a book that UEF published exploring common themes across religions, published in 2023. You helped write a foreword for that book and provided helpful feedback and insights along the way during the process. Um, I felt like that was very fitting because you are a bridge across humanity with your very rare professional and personal background as a Catholic priest in the Jesuit order, but also a professor of Hindu studies and comparative theology, which to me I think bridges these gaps between academia and institutional religion and between two very different religious traditions. So, what were the foundations of love, learning, and play for you in your early life? And how do you think those things might have contributed to this unique path that you ended up taking later on in life?
No, thank you. That's a very good question to start with. And I think somebody of my age, a baby boomer, born in the early 1950s, I didn't grow up with a particularly diverse or interreligious view of the world.
Mm,
Irish Catholic, New York. We were all church-going Catholics. I was an altar boy. The nuns taught me in grammar school. I went to a Jesuit high school, so many of my teachers were priests in secondary school in Manhattan. And basically, then I entered the seminary right from there. But I think that kind of training could have led to a very kind of narrow, inward-looking Catholic view of the world, even though the
yeah.
word Catholic kind of intimates universality. Catholic with a big C is the Roman Catholic, and with a small c is this kind of universal applying to the whole world. And I think I learned in those early days um, to understand that love and learning go together, and that we were taught again and again that in school, in choices you make as a student, you're showing you're using your talents, you're learning, you're studying, and then you're also preparing yourself to be someone who not only loves your family, but can love people in need in their times of trouble. And I think those kind of held together in my early life, even before I had any slightest idea that I might end up going to India or in Nepal. And play was kind of like the add-on because it's part of the wonderful book that Akhil Gupta wrote. Um, and it kind of opens the idea that I take it to be, it could be, just playing around, playing sports, dancing, singing, whatever one does for enjoyment. But it's also a sense of that loving and learning open into a kind of a freedom in your life. Um, you can play because you're not constricted entirely or bound by rules. You
Mm,
can enjoy life. You can sort of play around, even if you're studying, even if you're in church or temple, and so on. So I think we could talk much more about this, but there are kind of roots in growing up. Fortunate enough of my age to grow up in a coherent tradition, practicing religious family that kind of gave me some of the basics that I think now, many years later, still stick with me.
great. Yeah, that was an awesome answer. I appreciate the detail and um, yeah, I love hearing that. So moving on a bit, you're known as a pioneering figure in the subject of comparative theology, which I think is a discipline that very strongly embodies love, learning, and play, about as much as any academic field could. Um, so, in layman's terms, can you explain just the difference between comparative religion and comparative theology, why you think the latter is so important to teach and advocate for?
Yeah. So let me just for a moment, I'll put out a few terms that I think will help clarify what this is about.
Yeah, that'd
Um,
be great.
so in my understanding, in 40 years ago when I started developing what I call comparative theology, the two of the main options, three of the main options that were before somebody like me as a young scholar, becoming a professor and so on like that, was on the one side theology, and for me, in my context, that meant Catholic theology. And Catholic theology, back to St. Augustine, St. Anselm, meant faith-seeking understanding. And faith-seeking understanding were understood to be faith-seeking understanding primarily through the study of the Bible, the learning the wisdom of the Bible, the revelation given in the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, and then the great tradition of the church, all the teachers, the theologians, the saints, all through the ages up to the 20th century, that all these figures, that's what theologians did. They studied these things in depth. So
Hmm.
that's one side of it. And, we called it, as I said, faith-seeking understanding. There's a grounding in faith there, and yet there's a seeking also. And that it's not that faith cuts off the seeking and makes you unable to learn anything.
Hmm.
You're ever on a quest in the face with the mystery of God to be able to understand what it is you say you believe. So that's on one side. The other side, and I'll get to the comparative theology. On the other side, in school, like at the University of Chicago, where I did my PhD studies, the study of religion, comparative religion, history of religions, were kind of quasi-scientific disciplines in which somebody, sought objectivity, sought to stand outside the traditions they studied. They might
Hmm.
on, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday been believing, practicing members of a religious community, but that was sort of keep that out of your work. Don't
Yeah.
bring that in. Leave that
Hmm.
aside, and just do your work as a historian, archaeologist, sociologist, anthropologist, and study the religions. Your own, you keep a distance, and the other, you look at it through the kind of the scientific eye, often leading to kind of a distancing from what believers in that tradition actually believed. Because
Hmm.
what do they know about the roots of their religion? So you kind of look at it more scientifically than they ever would. And I said to myself, as a young um, priest getting to Boston College to teach in '84, with Jesuit priestly training and also PhD University of Chicago, I wanted something in between. On the one hand, I didn't just want to be a Catholic theologian studying Catholic things, writing and teaching in a Catholic school, all of which is wonderful for other people to do. I don't criticize other people doing it.
Sure.
And on the other hand, I got into all this because I actually I felt kind of driven by my faith, not despite my faith, but my faith kind of pushing me out from the Catholic upbringing I had to India, to Nepal, to learning from Hinduism and Buddhism, and to bring that faith to bear and learning from the other. So I kind of compromised in terminology. On the one side, not theology, but comparative theology,
Hmm.
and which I define as kind of faith-seeking understanding as crossing religious borders. So you don't just study, I mean, it's wonderful to study the Bible and the Christian tradition, but you also study Buddhist suttas, the Quran, the great books of Hinduism, the Tao, Confucian texts, African oral traditions. You begin to study outside what you grew up with, all of that, bringing that into faith-seeking understanding. And on the other hand, not simply the objective scientific study of religion, but right out there in the middle of it, part of what I say and what I write is, by the way, I'm a believer. And
Hmm.
I believe I'm writing, in so many of my books, I talk about saying, this is all about technical matters of Hindu theology, Hindu Sanskrit texts, Tamil texts, but you have
Hmm.
to know that I'm not a Hindu. I'm learning from a Catholic Christian position.
Yeah.
And I want people to know that my faith is there and my faith makes a difference. So comparative theology is sort of between the scientific world and the believers kind of inside the church world. And this would apply, people who are only within Hinduism or only within Islam or Judaism, or scholars who are simply scientific historians. Comparative theology is trying to do many things at once.
Great. Yeah. I love a lot of things you said there. And I think you probably ended up at a very good place being at HDS because my experience from being at Harvard Divinity School, I really appreciated how the school made space for both sides, right? You know, true believers and then the pure scholars. And sometimes those are completely separate people. Oftentimes they're embodied in one person. And I think
Yeah.
often comes from a very loving place of, trying to bridge those two perspectives. And it is very refreshing for me, or was in my academic experience, to know that there were professors like you who understood in the same way that I felt that owning up to and being honest about your own personal commitments doesn't detract from your ability to be rigorous in a scholarly sense. And in fact, I think the two often go together. Just to kind of throw in like a funny anecdote about somebody that was a former colleague of yours at University of Chicago, my mentor in college, Jeffrey Kripal.
Oh,
um,
yes.
yeah. So he was the department chair when I came into Rice as an undergraduate, and it was then called the Department of Religious Studies. And by the time I left, it was called the Department of Religion. And I asked him why they changed it. And he was telling me that this was like the third or fourth time they've changed the name. Um, and the reason it was changed was because, in other humanities departments, you call it history, you call it philosophy, you don't call it historical studies, you don't call it philosophical studies.
Hmm. Hmm.
But all of that's to say that, especially with a subject like religion, titles are tricky. It's hard to come up with like the perfect title or something that conveys what you want. But it's also to say that titles do matter, and I think you have struck a nice balance here with the title of comparative theology.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that, right at this point, as we're talking, I've done 21 years teaching at Boston College and now 21 at Harvard. So I have half and half of my postgraduate school career. And BC is a wonderful, big, prospering,
Hmm.
Catholic university. Many great people there. I still have friends there. Um, and yet thinking within and for the Catholic Church, and not in a narrow-minded, chauvinistic way, but kind of broader for the common good of all people. But Harvard, coming to Harvard, in 2005, so 21 years ago, coming here and finding people of very diverse traditions. By the time I came, it was no longer simply a progressive Protestant seminary, but more or less had said our stake in the future is to be multi-faith and to be multiple traditions here, hiring faculty increasingly of different faith traditions or teaching different faith traditions, and then having a student body that, even from your time at the school to now, is even more diverse.
Mm,
And even what, older people think religion or religions are, and students who come in, 25, 27 years old, what their experience of religion is, or the religion and the spiritual, it's all over the place. And being
mm,
a divinity school, you can study it in the classroom, and you can also join a multi-faith prayer group, the
right.
Wednesday noon service that groups still take time with. You can go to a Roman Catholic service one week, a neo-pagan group another week, a Theravada Buddhist group, uh, Orthodox Jewish group, and on and on and on. And I think that's good for all of us to be kind of exposed to different ways of looking at the world and imagining. And Harvard Divinity School, I think, celebrates that. The thing about BC, it was so deeply rooted in Catholic tradition, it had to keep reminding itself to open up.
Yeah.
I think Harvard Divinity School is opened up like to the extreme, has to remember it's really good to have roots somewhere. Like, where do you actually stand?
Yeah.
Who are you? And to try to
Yeah.
get back to that as well. And I think, the love and the learning part of love, learning, and play would be that about, what do you really love deeply? And when you learn, where are you learning from? And
Hmm.
then play, in the classroom, use your imagination, intuit, take it out in different directions and see where it goes. And that's the freedom of a university. We're able to do that.
Yeah, awesome. On that note, because I think it is good for people to have kind of this context of where you're coming from academically and what comparative theology means and all that. But that's just sort of like backdrop I wanted to set. Um, but on the note of what you just said, um, I think in sort of like the context of religion and scholarship, like the love and learning aspects, might be fairly clear in terms of this love, learn, play trio, right? But I think people think about academia and people think about religion, um, and the last thing that comes to mind for them is play, and particularly like monastic order like the Jesuits. I think people also maybe have this conception that there's these very like solemn vows that get taken and there's no room for play. And I don't think that's true. Saint Ignatius, who founded the Jesuits, saw imagination as a very powerful tool, and I think imagination is inherently a playful thing. Um, so play can take many forms, and I was just wondering if you could say more about the role of play in your life and in your work.
Yeah, I mean, you made an excellent insight there. First of all, just about the perception, and you can see it, sort of sometimes, melodramatically and even grotesquely, in Hollywood movies and so on about, the monks there are sober and serious and
Yeah.
totally, um, either cold-blooded or cold-minded, cold-hearted people who are totally dedicated to the mission and have
Hmm.
never smile and totally, only live on crust of bread and so on like that. Um, so that kind of overdoing it. But I think also people may find that I tried to talk about this in my autobiography, the uh, Hindu and Catholic priest and scholar that came out a couple of years ago, about right up front saying, well, look, as a religious in a religious order, I have vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience.
Hmm.
And those might say, well, those, what do you do for fun? Well, those cancel the fun. So any, money we get and earn, I have a Harvard professor's salary, goes to
Hmm.
the order and not to me personally. I have what I need and more than what I need, but I can't like pile it up and buy a second house and so on like that.
Hmm.
Chastity means we're celibate. We don't marry. We have esteem. I think we learned, in the past generations, first of all, the abuses of what priests have done terribly sometimes, but also to honor and say, God gave to human beings love for one another, which is physical as well as spiritual. And that's a good thing. There's nothing shameful or less holy about being married, being in a relationship. It's all good.
Hmm.
And yet to say some people, as in the gospel, Jesus says, leave everything and come follow me. That there are people who can be called to like a more intense love of God and a very different kind of love of neighbor. And then obedience, which in theory really just means to be on mission. So the earliest Jesuits in the 16th century started traveling around the world, and our founder Ignatius Loyola you mentioned, and his successors, would tell young Jesuits, okay, now I think we need you in Germany to teach in the school. Now wait a minute, you have to work in a parish in Italy. Now wait a minute, we need you in French Canada. We need you in South India. And the guys would kind of salute or do some kind of a submissive gesture and then take off. Um, the idea is that, we shouldn't be too comfortable wherever we are. And we're always kind of ready to go on a mission, particularly if the Pope, so any Pope, not just the recent popes, but any Pope asked us to do something, like there are Jesuits, in Lebanon risking their lives in the midst of the war there. There are Jesuits in Venezuela, trying to help out with the earthquakes. There are Jesuits at risk in other parts of the world. And there are Jesuits like me, risking my life here in Cambridge, Massachusetts by worrying about crossing the street without getting hit by a bicycle. Um, but the order could ask me to go somewhere else. As I get older and older, it's less and less likely, but the idea that we're mobile and move. So then your question is really very apt. How does the play part come in? And I think you touch very nicely on the root of it, is that, the very austere little book that guides Jesuit life that Ignatius Loyola, our founder in the 16th century, wrote based on his own mystical experiences, is a kind of very dry little book, more like a cookbook than a mystical treatise, in which he says, you get up in the morning, you do this, you have a second meditation, a third meditation, a fourth meditation. This is the way you should meditate in the evening. You should restrict what you're eating. You should think about your sins. You should look every day at the life of Christ and realize you could be like that. It's all very kind of, rule oriented.
Hmm.
And yet, as you say, what he's really saying is here's like the skeletal structure. Here's
Yeah.
the here's the structure of the day. Now go and do something with it. And
Hmm.
maybe in some novitiates and some training sites, there would be a very, an austere priest in a black cassock looking down the row and seeing if everybody's behaving. But for most of us, this is the structure. Go to the Gospels, go to the stories that have kept you going all these years, and basically imagine yourself part of it. Um, so like stories like Jesus, the people come to hear Jesus, and it's late in the evening, and there's no food, and the disciples say, "Send them away," and he says, "No, we have to feed them." And he said, "But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." And he says, "Well, feed them anyway." And suddenly it multiplies. And he sort of says, imagine yourself in that scene. Maybe you're the boy who had the loaves and fishes. Maybe you're an apostle who says, get rid of them. What does the bread taste like? How many men and women are there? Um,
Hmm.
do you go up and thank Jesus for what happened? Um, Use your imagination, or you're at the cross. Jesus is dying on the cross. Would you be one of those men who ran away and hid because you're afraid of getting arrested? Or are you one of those women who said, we loved him from the beginning, we're going to love him at the end? What do you say when you're there next to Mary Magdalene or Mary, the mother of Jesus? Use your imagination. And I think what Ignatius was doing is saying, have the tradition, have the teaching of the church, follow the rules about the hours of the day and so on like that. Keep silence during the days of the 30 days of the long retreat, as we call it. Then use your imagination and make it mean something for you, because when the retreat is over, you have to go back out into the world. You have to go out into the world and serve God's people and learn and live and love in all kinds of new ways. And there's not going to be anybody there telling you what to do. And that's where I think that's where the play comes in. Again, it could sound like, spoil sport. This isn't really play. This is sort of like having imagination when you do your work. But
Hmm.
it's supposed to be ultimately, sustaining and life-giving. That and we know this, professors know this, scientists know this, parents know this, husband and wife know this. You got to somehow enjoy being together and enjoy what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to burn out when you're 40 or 50 or 60, and it's not going to work anymore. So how do you find ways to be free even in urgent situations? I think what Ignatius was saying was to figure out how to have that sense of freedom and joy in everything you're doing based on the loving you've been doing all your life, the learning you've been doing all your life. And I would say, certainly in Hinduism, I mean, it's famous, as you would know. I mean,
Hmm.
Hindu tradition, such an emphasis on, karma as right ways of acting, good work, service of the community, helping others, jnana as knowledge, the learning. You sit with your teacher, you learn from your teacher, then you become a teacher. And then the bhakti, or the love, modeled, let's say, most famously, perhaps in this context, on Krishna and the
Hmm.
Leela of Krishna, Krishna dancing with the cowherd girls, Krishna playing the flute. And this idea that true learning and true service become this kind of joyful dance. And that's not a very strong image in Catholic tradition, although you can find saints who talk about dancing, or the Psalms in the Bible talk about dancing. But the idea that I've learned from Hinduism is at some point you let it go and you open up and you have this kind of freedom that's bodily as well as mental, psychological, spiritual. And that's what gets you up in the morning and gets you to keep doing it for 60, 70 years, whatever. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I think there's a strong parallelism there between what you were saying about the sort of skeletal guidelines set out to you and other Jesuits, but sort of taking that beyond from like this abstract idea and really like embodying it in a way where once the idea gets embodied, it's going to look different for everybody. And I think that's sort of, when at UEF, when we say that flourishing is loving, learning, and playing, doing everything that you do with a love, learn, play mindset. I think that's sort of um, something that's worth emphasizing is this goes beyond just like abstract thoughts, and that's the whole reason we're having this conversation is what do these things actually look like in person? And again, they look different for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you were saying, sometimes um, the clearest way to see that is just in like an image, like Krishna playing the flute, right? So I'm curious if there's any image that comes to mind for you of like either an anecdote in your personal life or like some cherished story in Hindu scriptures or Christian scriptures, just like one really evocative image or scene or moment of that really just embodies like loving, learning, and playing to you.
Yeah. Probably there's so many I could point to. Let me start on the Hindu side with Krishna again. I
Yeah.
could go to other figures certainly, but Krishna again, comes across in the Hindu scriptures in different ways. And so there's the somewhat terrifying austere teacher of the Bhagavad Gita, who is there on the battlefield with Arjuna, and
Mm,
and yet says, do everything out of love for me. Think of me in love. Put your mind on me. Put your heart on me. Trust me completely, and you will be taken care of. And somehow I think the tradition has seen that's compatible with the stories of the boy Krishna in the village in Vrindavan, playing with the other kids, um, putting dirt in his mouth, and it turns out the universe is inside him in some way, playing the flute, dancing, as I said, with the girls, and then one day he'll be, whacking a demon and killing a demon who's been out to get him, and then he'll be smiling again and dancing. Um, and I think, and certainly, think of the image of Shiva, Nataraj, one of the great images of Indian art. Shiva with his foot raised and holding his hand, the drum, and the flame in his hand, and the fire around. It's meant to be an entirely dynamic image. And most of the portrayals of the Nataraj, there's a smile on the face of Shiva,
mm,
and he's enjoying it, and the world is somehow that dance, and you're basically invited, to become part of the dance and to join in. Um, the Bible is a serious book, and there are lots of all kinds of serious things going on in the Bible. Two things that come to mind from the Hebrew Bible. One would be King David, the great king who even in the time of Jesus, 1,000 years later, Jesus is considered the son of David and the heir to David's kingdom, because David, who had his own problems and committed his own sins, loved God.
mm,
Um, and in one scene, he is outside the temple. I'd have to look it up to get the details exactly straight, but he breaks into a dance in the Lord's presence. And he's dancing kind of wildly, whether he'd been drinking a little wine or not, I forget. But uh, one of the women, and it might be his wife, but again, I'd have to look it up, scolds him, saying, "This is not becoming to a king. You're dancing like a madman. Your garments are falling off," and so on like that. That's so embarrassing. Please don't do that again. And he says, "But I'm dancing before the Lord. And the Lord you dance for, you do it with your whole body, mind, soul, everything." And many of the Psalms in the Bible, the 150, poems of the Psalms are attributed to David. And so many of them are full of joy and dancing, dance in the presence of the Lord. The other Hebrew Bible example is the Song of Songs. And the
Hmm.
Song of Songs is the incredible mystical book. So you have the prophets and you have the law and you have books of wisdom, all kinds of powerful teachings in the Hebrew Bible. But the Song of Songs, which barely, if at all, mentions God, is like a parable. It's a parable about the young man and young woman in love and the ins and outs of their relationship. They're finding each other, losing each other, coming back together, their enjoyment in describing what each other look like, using kind of very, flourishing, florid imagery about how beautiful they are. And it seems to be saying, this is not pretense, it's not a show, but they're showing how beautiful it is to be in love and to find one another. And that this has been taken by rabbis and by Christian pastors and so on down through the ages to be paradigmatic of that's what the spiritual life is like.
Hmm.
Eventually, you reach the level of the mystical marriage, and to be able to imagine being in love with God is like being that young woman or that young man, and God is the other. And you dance and you find each other, which leads me to the Christian example. And we could keep going on other examples, but in the Gospel according to John, which is the fourth of the four Gospels, often considered a very solemn and serious gospel, kind of at a more philosophical, lofty level. Um, in the second chapter, after Jesus has called his first disciples, um, it says, and he went, Mary was his mother, was invited to a wedding feast in Cana in Galilee. And she's invited to the wedding feast. And it just says, like in passing, and Jesus and his companions came also. And we don't know the name of the young couple. We don't know what exactly the connection was. Was it a relative or whatever? But suddenly, Jesus, who's on the beach in the, first chapter of John is stressed. The Word became flesh. The Word dwelt among us. The Word was there with God in the beginning. First thing the Word does really is go to a wedding party. And that's a sense of, yes, that is it. And then, as you know the story, the wedding feast goes on. I'm sure people are dancing and drinking and eating and having a good time. Mary goes over to Jesus and says, it's getting to be an embarrassment because they've run out of wine. And I guess, a poor enough family with vigorous, enthusiastic enough guests, there wasn't enough wine for the good party that's there. It would be an embarrassment for the couple to say, I'm sorry, we're out of wine. And Jesus says, what does this have to do with me? Is this what I came for? Well, you think I'm a wine merchant, or what do you think I'm here for? And he says, it's not my time for this. And she says nothing more. And then the next scene says he went over to the servants, on the side and says these six urns. And apparently they were like, I don't know, 20 gallons each or something like that. Incredible, large urns that were for holding liquid. He says, fill each one of them to the brim with water. That's all he says. And then it says, call the master of the feast, the MC, to taste the water. And he comes over and it's the best wine. And he says to the young couple, what are you doing? Usually at weddings, we put out the good wine first before they're drunk. And then when they're drunk, they'll drink anything. But you have saved the best wine for last. And it's sort of, and then presumably, all night long, 180 gallons more of wine suddenly appear, the best wine. Somehow John is saying, in the midst of the solemnity and seriousness about the word and the world, Jesus is the one who's there at a wedding feast, just like he's the one who has so much bread for the people that they have baskets left over. Eat, drink, and be merry in a certain way. There's a certain kind of joy there. And Christian tradition, down through the ages, have taken that as a cautionary reminder. As you said earlier, you can end up thinking of the Christian life as very austere, very solemn, people doing penance constantly with a sour face. And yet remember the first sign that he gave in the Gospel of John was to make an abundance of wine at the wedding feast. Later in another gospel, he's criticized, saying, look, the leaders of the people, they're very proper and they're always fasting and being serious. John the Baptist, who came before you, he didn't, he was a vegetarian. He didn't drink wine. He was a very serious man. Why you, Jesus, are you having such a good time all the time? And he says, because when the wedding party is on, you have a good time. And
Hmm.
when the groom is not with you anymore, then you can fast. But as long as you have God in your life, let the wedding feast continue.
Hmm.
I just add to that a footnote. One of my favorite novels of all time is The Brothers Karamazov,
Me too.
Dostoevsky's great novel. And in the scene there in the middle of it, when Alyosha, the youngest of the brothers, is kind of crushed because the elder Zosima has died and doesn't seem to be a holy man because there's like a smell where the saints are not supposed to have any smell after they die. He remembers that Zosima had told him about the wedding feast.
Hmm.
And then at that moment, suddenly the deacon there at the side of the coffin starts reading from the Cana from the chapter I just mentioned, chapter 2 of John. And Alyosha runs outside and has this kind of unitive experience. He's one with the world, one with nature, the stars, with animals and everything. And I think Dostoevsky saw that in a certain mystical sense, the wedding feast is really what life is all about. And if you
Hmm.
let yourself go in it, you become one with everything in God's world. So there's a lot of play there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are beautiful images, and I think one of the recurring attributes across the images you cited is one of the words you said, abundance. Like there's, giant gallons of wine, like giant containers of gallons and gallons of wine. Um, and then, as you said, like the dance of Shiva, there's like somehow the world itself is this one great cosmic dance. Like there's something, um, very abundant and almost infinite about these things. Um, and I think that's one of the reasons we always say like flourishing is loving, learning, and playing, because there are so many things you can pursue in life thinking like this will bring me happiness, that maybe have the illusion of abundance. Um, but ultimately it's these things, loving, learning, and playing, that we can do like almost infinitely, because
Mhm.
there's something inherent about them in the world, in us. Um,
Yeah.
and so, it seems like you, based on what you've said about your life and your work so far, you've been able to kind of tap into um, those insights and those states of being. Um, but as abundant as they are, it is easy sometimes to forget that those three things are there for us at any moment, and it's up to us to embrace them. There's all sorts of obstacles that get in the way. I'm wondering if there was any time in your life that kind of stands out, when you felt a bit more disconnected from loving, learning, and playing, and what that felt like in terms of whether you felt like you were flourishing or not, and how you managed to get yourself back on track.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good question for all of us because if you have too rosy, optimistic a picture and say, life is one big party and everything is fine, first of all, you're rather, clueless about the suffering of the people around you. Uh,
Mm,
because
yeah.
I'm having a great time, so I don't know what your problem is. But also looking at your own life can say, can you really be, so I'm 75. I mean, can you really be 75 years old and say every day was like flourishing, everything was fine? Um, I think at various points in my life, I had no major crisis. I didn't have I didn't, leave a religious order. I didn't have any great health crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing very dramatic. But I think at various points, it was like losing a grip on the environment I was in. So
Mm,
let me, this is in my book, The Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, the memoir, um, about going to Nepal after college in 1973 and very much wanting to be like Mahatma Gandhi and Mother Teresa. So, don't set your standards low, go pretty high. And, basically be there among the people and serve the people. And it was kind of, and of course, I'm not a Mother Teresa, I'm not a Mahatma Gandhi, but I was also not even working with the street kids very much. I did some social work in the neighborhood, but I was basically at a fairly privileged boys' school.
Mm.
And unlike Mother Teresa, who left the girls' school and went out on the streets, I pretty much taught in the school, had a marvelous time, learned from it. But it was kind of nagging me, we're pretty comfortable here. It was poor by American standards, but what about the people outside the gate? And what about people in other places? Is this really privilege? And that kind of thing has always bothered me, from then all the way to now. As I sit here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a Harvard professor, privilege.
Yeah.
I don't often feel I have a lot of power or anything like that, but nonetheless, privilege, a comfy life, not a, I have health insurance, all those things. What about the people who don't? And where are you in
Mhm.
relation to them? So that kind of nagging concern. And I think it was dramatically put forward for me when I came back from Nepal. My first, after 2 years there, I came back to study theology to be ordained, and came back and was here in Cambridge, Massachusetts for the first time, 1975, to study theology at what was then a Jesuit school in Cambridge. It's now over at Boston College. But feeling like, what is this for? And
Mm.
since I was, I don't know, 4 years old, began to read. I've been reading, reading, reading. I'm a learner. I love study. I, love books and so on like that. But kind of coming back and saying, here we are. I was in South Asia. I saw really poor people. I was aware of the problems of the real world. And here I am in another comfy house in comfy Cambridge, Massachusetts, reading scholarly works about the Bible, reading scholarly theological texts. Um, what's the point of all this? Is this really what religious life is about? And it was kind of a sense of, maybe I'm losing my way, and maybe
Mm.
it would be better to put this aside and again do what Mother Teresa did. She didn't know what she was really doing, leave the convent and go out into the streets and then see what happens. And that's when she founded her own order, to work with the poorest of the poor. So I think that time was kind of a crisis time. Do I really want to be a Jesuit? And do I really want to stick with this? When in some ways it seems because I'm the professor, even then, 25 years old, oh, you're going to be a professor someday, the professorial type. Do I really want to live on college campuses and teach in nice places and and do that kind of thing all my life? Or do I want to pull out? And I had like two intuitions there. One was, and I didn't follow up on either of them. One was to leave, get married, and go find a young woman I could be with, and we would do great things together in the city for the poor and happily ever after somewhere else, because I'd be freer then to do the right thing. And the other
Mhm.
was the contrasting thing was go to a monastery and be a monk and just leave Cambridge behind and go to an austere monastery in the mountains and just stay there the rest of my life. Because if you're mediocre in the middle. You're neither with the people and you're neither entirely dedicated to God. You're going to classes, you're studying books, then you're teaching and you're writing books. How do you find a way? But I think what happened, I found, and this is again in my memoir, another experience like after that kind of first year of crisis, a sense of God saying, you are where you need to be.
Mhm.
Don't give up on it. And so I think, because it could have turned into an unhappy life, like
Yeah.
almost wishing I had done something else, or it could have turned into a failure. You should have done something else because you can't do this. But somehow the sense I strongly believe, and it's sort of it's in the Gospels, but also the Gita and elsewhere, what God calls you to, God enables you to do. And God enables you to do it with a certain joy and happiness too. And so, for some people, I think it was, they're called to do something they really don't want to do, and they're afraid to do it because it's really dangerous. And other
Mm.
people, when they were young, they had great hopes they were going to change the world and everything would be different, and they realize I'm not going to be able to do all that. But if you have spiritual grounding, you go back to that and say, God who got me this far will get you all the way. And so that was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago now. And I think I'm still at it, doing what I do. And I think I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I'm flourishing. Um, and that's a great gift, because as I said, I've had a fortunate life, but to be able to flourish and as best I can to help other people, including students at HDS. Yeah.
Great. And I think that's really relatable, and um, in an almost comforting way to hear because at UEF we talk about this love, learn, play framework for flourishing, but we also talk about like, well, what's getting in the way of that? What are the obstacles to flourishing? Um, and in the layperson world, right? Like we all feel like we're under this intense social script to like go to school and get a good job and make more money. It really feels like we're constantly being tugged towards this particular social script. Um, but it's interesting in what you're saying to hear like your perspective as somebody who's taken this very devotional religious path to know that you're not exempt from that either, right? It's just a different social script, and it's almost like you what you were saying before about like the sort of skeletal path is laid out from for you, but if you're just going to like follow that in a one-to-one way, then it feels like something's missing, right? And you almost have to get like creative about how you're going to do
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, we talk about like social scripts getting in the way of flourishing. We also talk about something called means ends inversion. So when you're prioritizing something like money as like an ultimate end to chase, when it should be something like a means, like you were saying about your salary, right? You're not collecting money to just buy another house or just amass a lot of money. You're collecting money so that you have what you need to sustain yourself and then do the work that you were called to do. Um, so money is like this very prime example of means ends inversion. But I'm curious, because you have this unique perspective compared to other people we've spoken to. Um, I'm curious if there are like spiritual commitments that appear across most religions, things like fasting or prayer, or the kind of monastic vows that you take, where there's like a higher intention for them in terms of like what they're enabling you to do. But they do feel like things that almost can become traps if you think of them as like ends to themselves, like just fasting for its own sake, or like, you know what I mean? So I'm
Yeah.
curious,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you have kind of noticed that, like what means ends inversion might look like in a religious context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I'll have to think about it more. I think first of all, there are ways in which this does cut across different religious traditions.
Hmm.
Um, because I don't know a lot about, I don't know about all religious traditions, but in the ones I know about, there seemed to be a consensus that there is the ordinary way to be a member of this faith, which is
Hmm.
perfectly good and given as a good way of life. And then there's like an exceptional, extreme form of it for some people. And so I
Hmm.
think, for instance, um, well, obviously in the Christian faith, most Christians marry, have families, or have partners, or in relationships, and that's perfectly good. That's given by God. And then
Hmm.
there are in the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox traditions, Mount Athos, and so on, monks who dedicate their lives to, poverty, chastity, obedience, and living in community. Um, and then you have Buddhist monks all over Asia, the Theravada Buddhist monks, one way of living it, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Japanese Zen masters, another way. Um, you have even and I know less about it, but the mainstreams of Shia and Sunni Islam. And then you have the Sufi traditions, where there seem to be some people who are set apart, who have a special role to play, and on and on. And I think Jainism is another example, maybe a more extreme example. You read these stories of these Digambara monks who go around, or naked, really literally naked, and they go around and they sweep in front of themselves and they totally have nothing literally. And then other Jains are quite good at business and run books, book publishing, and very, make a lot of money and are very generous with the money. And we are all Jains, and it's all part of one tradition. And I think in all the traditions, therefore, there should be some room for the person who's able and willing to go to the extreme, to leave everything and to after follow Christ's command, to follow what the Buddha is calling, what Krishna invites somebody to do, and on like that. There should be room for that, but to avoid the two problems that you're alluding to, I think one problem would be, now finally I am a monk or a priest or a Sufi. I am better than the rest of them.
Mm,
That
hmm.
kind of element, which invariably in different traditions is criticized by saying, the one thing you didn't get is that the real problems are inside you, and pride is one of the worst. And
Yeah.
so you can be totally ascetic and totally detached, and if you still think you're better than everyone else, you have a long way to go to realize that. And the other temptation would be to say it's like um, there's some ways in which you could say the spiritual life is like Olympic training, and you're an athlete and you're training, and there's the fasting. I'm certainly not an athlete at all, but I mean, people who are very disciplined about their exercising, their weightlifting, their diet, et cetera, all of that, and they get to the Olympics or they in the World Cup, whatever, all of that. Somebody who's, the process then it's in a sense becomes the end in itself. And they're so intense about it and so caught up in it. And I'm going to be, the best faster in the world, and I'm going to be the most ascetic person in the world. They forget that this is part of a larger game. You're part of something. You're going to be playing the game. You're part of something larger. And if you kind of quantify and say, for X number of years now, I've been an ascetic in the following way, and therefore I've perfected um, fasting, I perfected chastity, I perfected being obedient. That's not what it's for. Because in most traditions, there's a certain kind of tolerance and love for the what Christians would call the sinner. Um, the person who falls, fails, and then gets up and keeps going is better in many ways than the person who says, I've gotten to this age and I've never failed once, and I've just been perfect all these years. Um, to realize that life is not like that, and to be able to put it in perspective and say, as we would say in Jewish and Christian tradition, other traditions too, love of God and love of neighbor. This intense kind of concern and love for God, the transcendent, the mystery, the greatness, and then kind of a growing love for the people around you in larger and larger circles. If that love is not there, then you be the best at this and the most famous at that. You could be the most wealthy, but what is it for? You're not even happy at the end of it. You're not flourishing. You're not happy. Um, and therefore, to put it in perspective and say, I might have been happier if I had fallen off the horse several times along the way, and didn't break the record
Mm,
and screwed up now and then, but I got up and kept doing it. And
yeah.
that's better. That's more human. To you, it's human to fail, human to need forgiveness, to be forgiven, and to go on from there. But all the old manuals of like Christian monastic life warn that the easy things are like fasting, silence, getting up at 3 in the morning to pray. You can do all that. But the pride, the arrogance, the selfishness, the jealousy of those around you, when you're 98 years old and you're dying, you realize I'm still jealous, I'm still proud, I'm
Mm.
still annoyed at my neighbors because it's hard. And the Gita says this endlessly about, looking into the inner self and the entanglements of the mind and heart. And I think, what Akhil's book, the Love, Learn, Play, is really about on all these levels, not only showing yourself as different, but actually becoming a different person and allowing that to happen within you. And that's hopefully what every religious person and people who are spiritual and not religious, seekers are trying to do, but realizing that eventually it's not just something you can just snap your fingers and it happens. You have to like do what you can and then allow what you can't do to happen to you. And once you think I've got it together, I figured it out, then you're probably screwed up again. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer, and thank you for your time. I really appreciate you hopping on here. Just have one more question for you.
Sure.
To end things on an uplifting note. So, if people want to flourish more, if they want to learn more, love more, play more in their lives, I'm curious if there are any works of yours, um, or any cherished resources that you might have, that you would point people towards, whether it's books or available courses, something either you've worked on or have admired.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I know you mentioned your memoir, so feel free to say more about that as well, and where people can go to buy that or
Okay.
access any other
Let me
work.
grab a copy of it. It's over here.
Okay,
I don't know if this will show up on the screen, but it's
shows up perfect. Yeah, Hindu and
okay.
Catholic, priest and scholar, a love story.
And you get a bonus there. You get a picture of me in 1974 in the hills of Nepal. So this book came out from Bloomsbury 2 years ago, T&T Clark Bloomsbury. It's an inexpensive paperback, but it's also open access now. So
Oh,
it's
great.
you can go to the Bloomsbury site, just Clooney, Hindu and Catholic, and it'll guide you to the place where you can download the PDF of the book for free. So that I'd love you to buy the cover, everybody, so I can get royalties on it. But be more happy that you read the book, and so downloading it for free is fine. And that just gives you a sense of why I do what I do,
Yeah.
how it came about, how it fits together in my life. Um, I think in a way, it's a very different book than Akhil's book, The Love,
Hmm.
Learn, Play. But because he and I are good friends, and I think despite so many differences in our lives and all that, we have that in something in common. Reading Love, Learn, Play, and Hindu and Catholic priests and scholars side by side would be really good. Um, if somebody has nothing else to do in the summer, read The Brothers Karamazov, the great novel by Dostoevsky, which
I'll
is kind of
second that.
inspiration, and on with the scriptures and so on. Um, so I think it's amazing. We talked today about people spend all their time on their phones, all their time busy, this and that. To put that aside and read it sounds trivial, but read a good book. And it
Yeah.
could be read the Gospel of John, read the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, read a surah of the Quran, read the Psalms of David, um, on and on, these books of wisdom, and then modern stories, novels and stories by, young people who are writing today about the meaning of their life in kind of a post-religious, post-Christian world in America, people looking for meaning. There's so many inspirational stories. Um, so a lot to read. And then I would say probably people are happier too if they write something, to not be afraid and say, I too have a story to tell.
Hmm.
I too can put my word to paper and then share it with other people.
Yeah, love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Once again, appreciate your time. Thank you everyone else for listening. Check out Professor Clooney's book and visit uef.org if you want to listen to more conversations like this and for other resources.
Okay. And thank you, Alan. It's wonderful to be with you for this conversation.
Of course, our pleasure.